Hi, Heidi. Can you just start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do and the new book about the new book that you are releasing this spring?
Sure. My name is Heidi Russell, and I am a professor at Loyola University Chicago. I teach at the Institute of Pastoral Studies at Loyola. So my students are primarily going into pastoral ministry. Some of them will be working in parishes. Some of them will a lot of them will be becoming chaplains. And in addition to that, I am a full-time mom to my two children who teach me more about this world than anything else I've ever experienced in my life. And my new book, a lot of it comes out of that experience of being a mom and learning on the fly as I go. And the new book looks at trauma and stress and the science around how our nervous systems respond to both and how we move in this world. But I think it also looks at concepts of relationship and how we become who we are in and through the relationships that surround us.
So, the first question, this isn't the first book you've published with us at Liturgical Press. We published Quantum Shift with the subtitle Theological and Pastoral Implications of Contemporary Developments in Science in 2015, I believe.
Mhm.
So, what inspired you to write this new, very timely book, and does it develop on any of the ideas of quantum shift?
Yeah. I think, the biggest thing that changed between when I wrote Quantum Shift and when I wrote this book was that I became a parent. And I became a parent through the foster care system initially and then adoption. So I was taking these classes as I became a foster parent to become licensed. And that is where I probably first learned about trauma informed care. Uh, and I was really fascinated by it. And then other questions came up as I became a mother, as I was adopting my own children. Questions around epigenetics became very important to me. I started reading about that. And as I was reading these things, I kept being intrigued by the connections with theology, the questions about what it means to be a human person. And then I think that was even further elaborated on as I began reading parenting books. So in the book, I talk about Robin Goebel's work quite a lot. And her work is actually on parenting. But as I'm reading her book on kids with big baffling behaviors, she's talking about the nervous system. And I'm realizing how much this connects to our understanding of the human person. And when we start to talk about the human person, then how we understand concepts of sin and grace and freedom and free will and choice. So all of that led to my connecting what I was reading kind of in my personal life with the theological research I was doing. Where I definitely see it connecting to my work in quantum shift is probably twofold. One is just a continuing interest in science. So, as well as being interested in the big cosmological questions in quantum physics, I've also really always been really interested in neuroscience. The other piece of it is simply on the theological level, the ideas around creation. So, quantum shift kind of looked at creation on a cosmological level and looking at our who we are as human beings and our place in that huge cosmos and universe, whereas human flourishing kind of focuses in now on the creation of human beings and what it means to be human and what it means to be created by God as a human being and how we have evolved as human beings in the midst of all that.
It seems like you have certain figures, you already mentioned one, that you're inspired by or influenced by in your writing. One example that I liked was Father Gregory Boyle, who works with former gang members, and you highlight his writing throughout the book. Why'd you choose to highlight Father Boyle specifically? And are there any other figures that you think that our audience might be interested to hear are included in the book?
Yeah, I think some of this journey of writing often circles around influences that come into your life while you're doing the research. So this book was a multi-year project, and in the course of that time, I listened to a Lenten retreat podcast by Father Boyle, and I was just completely blown away by his work. And I started reading his books, and he came out with a new book shortly before the time I was finishing this book. And as I was reading that book, just out of my own interest, it was like everything he does in his ministry. I mean, I kind of knew this already and was planning on bringing him into the book anyways from his earlier books, but especially in his most recent book, Cherished Belonging, he exemplifies so many of the things that I was talking about in the book in terms of putting it into practice. And I will say, and we can talk more about this later, but one of the challenges for me in this book was that pivot to hope, right? How you move from this sort of trauma-filled world to hope. And Father Greg gives me hope. I feel like he shows a way forward, a way that it can be done. So I mentioned Robin Goebel as well, her book and her podcast and her website on parenting kids with big baffling behaviors. It's important for parents to read, I think, but anyone can get a lot of information from the work that she's doing because she takes our nervous system and she puts it into really easy ways to understand. She uses these image of our watchdog brain and our possum brain and our owl brain, which, breaks it down for kids, but it also breaks it down for adults and helps us understand it better as well. Another influence, two influences actually, in terms of polyvagal theory. One was Deb Dana's work. And I really drew on her work. I taught a class, I teach a class on trauma-informed theology. And so I really drew on her work when I was creating the syllabus for my class. And I really resonate with her work, and my students really resonated with her work. So just using her breakdown and her explanation of polyvagal theory, but also her really practical insights of how you put it into practice was helpful. And then the final one, I mean, obviously Stephen Porges, but Seth Porges is his son. They actually wrote a book together, but before they published their book, Seth Porges had done this YouTube video, which I cite in the book, where he explains polyvagal theory, and he does it really, it's so accessible. I've used it with my classes. I've recommended it to so many people because the way he breaks down the theory and explains it is and helps you apply it to your life is really useful. So his explanation of his father's work, Stephen Porges, is another influence I would cite there. And interestingly, his mother is Sue Carter, who is a neurobiologist, and she is the neurobiologist that did the breakthrough work on oxytocin as the neurochemical that creates love and bonding and social relationships. So I just think it's fascinating that he has these parents, Sue Carter and Stephen Porges, who are these great names, and then he takes their work and makes it accessible to the public.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how you structured the book and why you chose to do it that way?
Yeah. While I was working on the book, I was really focused again on this concept of creation. So my original thought was that I was going to structure it around us being created for survival, being created for relationship, and being created for community. But I was actually really struggling to get the material to fall into those three categories. And while I was reading about creation and focusing on the idea that we are created co-creators, which is Phillip Heffner's idea, I was reading a book that was co-authored by it. The first half of the book is Phillip Heffner's work, but then the second half of the book is chapters written by other authors about Phillip Heffner's book, or about his writing. And one of the chapters was by Jason Roberts. And the book, by the way, is Human Becoming in an Age of Science, Technology, and Faith. And Jason Roberts is one of the editors of the book. And in his chapter, he takes Phillip Heffner's idea of the created co-creator, and he expands it to the idea of the created co-creator, the created co-redeemer, and the created co-sanctifier. And when I read his chapter, all of this material fell into place for me, because now I had a way of talking about our created aspect of both survival, but also how our relationships co-create us. And then the middle section, where I really wanted to get into sin on levels of systemic sin, generational trauma, historical trauma, and our role as agents basically in fixing these really massive problems. His idea of being created co-redeemers really made that chapter fit into the, or that section fit into this book. And then of course the being created co-sanctifiers fit in with the idea of how we move to healing and hope and grace.
That's really interesting. Research has shown that well over half the population is living with some sort of trauma. How can our faith communities and pastoral leaders better serve that reality? And do our current models fail to speak to that reality?
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to something I was saying earlier, which was that the last section of this book was honestly the hardest for me to write. I struggled a lot in finding hope in this topic because of the statistics that you state, right? So many people struggle with trauma, even those of us who may not have had horrific trauma in our life. We struggle with so much stress and anxiety and division in our world. And I think part of that was wanting people to take what they were reading in the book and make this shift with me from, the trauma informed care shift is from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. Or Robin Goebel will talk about it as, getting curious, being more curious. And I think that that shift is really important in terms of shifting from sort of a sin-based perspective to a grace-based perspective, a relationship and pastoral care-based perspective. So I think part of what I also wanted the book to do in that sense was, again, create this awareness. One of those first R's is recognizing the trauma that's in our midst. So people who are in congregations, whether they're ministers or, churchgoers, recognizing that within their community trauma exists, and how to hold people in supportive communal relationships in the midst of that trauma. But then also be more aware and be better at reaching out to vulnerable populations. I think our church communities can get really insular, and we don't always do a good job of reaching out, especially to people who are different than us. And part of that, again, goes right down to our nervous system, right? Like familiar feels safe, unfamiliar feels like a threat. Our nervous system interprets what is unfamiliar as a threat. So really encouraging people to move to this idea of advocacy and reaching out and trying to make a difference in people's lives. Because I do think we have a fundamental impulse towards empathy and towards compassion. But sometimes we get caught up in those fear cycles. So if we understand our own nervous system, then we can identify like, oh, I'm having this sort of response because I'm feeling a little anxious right now. And then that helps us regulate and calm down and connect.
Yeah, so true. How do you hope people will use your book, and what do you hope they will take away from it?
Yeah, I think my hope is that people reading the book will come away with a different understanding of the human person, so that they'll be able to understand themselves better. They'll be able to understand their relationships better. They'll be able to understand the effects of stress and trauma on themselves and others. And again, I think that movement from judgment, and I think all of us are subject to that tendency to judge, right? That movement from judgment to compassion and empathy, that once we understand what's going on in ourselves and others, we tend to be less judgmental and more compassionate, more empathetic. And again, I think helping people realize the importance of advocating, to being agents of change, realizing how much of this exists on a systemic structural level, but rather than feeling like, oh, there's nothing I can do about it, feeling like, well, what can be the thing I advocate for? How could how could I make a difference, knowing that one person can make a difference in somebody's life? So maybe it's just connecting with one other person who is going through stress or going through trauma, but also then on a systemic level, advocating for this awareness to flow through our school system, through our criminal justice system. When we talk about families and policies and work environments and family leave, things like that, how can we use the influence that we each have in our own spheres to make those changes on a systemic level as well?
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to say? Any final thoughts?
Not particularly, other than just to say that I think our learning about the human person is ongoing. And that's part of what's so exciting about this field, right? Like, we're constantly learning new things about what it means to be human. And whether it was my work in quantum shift, looking at the science around, again, quantum physics and cosmology, or this work where I'm going more into a little bit into neuroscience, but also into just our nervous system and um, our way of being in the world and interacting with other people, continuing to learn about those things should impact the way we think about God, should impact the way we think about human beings, should impact the way we think about sin and grace and creation. So just to continue learning and to continue being curious, I think.
Thanks for watching this conversation with Heidi Russell. Her new book, Human Flourishing in a World of Trauma and Stress, is available now at litpress.org.